How do you solve a $607 million crisis for exactly $0? And I'm asking because this is about way more than just fish in a river. This is about what actually happens when you try to buy your way out of a massive, compounding debt. Government threw everything they had at the Illinois River to stop the Asian carp invasion. They built a $25 million electric barrier. They funded helicopter surveys. They paid out endless commercial bounties. But here's the problem. By 2010, in some stretches of the water, Asian carp still made up 95% of the total biomass. They were literally choking out the native system. The budget was drained, and the crisis was still completely out of control. Then, around 2019, the carp numbers suddenly crashed. If you ask most people what happened, they'll tell you that capitalism and human engineering finally caught up, that paying fishermen by the pound eventually did the trick. But that answer is dangerously incomplete. Because researchers found that the sharpest drops in the carp population were happening in specific stretches of the river where absolutely zero human removal programs were operating. No boats. No bounties. No electric barriers. To understand what actually wiped out the carp, we can't look at the government contracts. We have to ask a much stranger, much more uncomfortable question. What happens when the exact asset you need to save your entire system is the one thing you've spent the last 100 years trying to destroy? So here's what everyone thought happened. When you have a crisis this big, the logical move is to throw money at it. Illinois started literally paying commercial fishermen by the pound to pull Asian carp out of the water. Bow fishing tournaments started offering massive cash prizes. And it makes total sense, right? You pay humans to remove a pest, and eventually, the pest goes away. And honestly, for a long time, that's exactly what the public assumed was working. But if you really think about it, if human bounties were the answer, the carp numbers would only be dropping in the areas where the boats were operating. But that isn't what was happening. In the spring of 2019, a researcher named Dr. Marie Holloway was looking at her data on the lower Illinois River. She had 6 years of consistent, rock-solid baseline records. But suddenly, 3 of her test sites showed a sharp, massive downward spiral in carp density. Think about this from her perspective for a second. You're sitting in a lab looking at impossible math. There are absolutely zero human removal programs operating in these specific stretches of the river. No commercial boats. No bounties. So she assumed what any rational scientist would assume, her equipment was broken. She actually went back out and replaced the sonar. The numbers stayed low. She doubled the physical survey effort. The numbers stayed low. Finally, she set up environmental DNA testing, basically testing the water column itself to see if the genetic footprint of the fish was still there. It wasn't. The carp were physically missing from the water. If you love that feeling when a massive, arrogant system gets proven wrong by hard data, hit the like button. That realization is always satisfying. And by the way, stories like this, where forgotten underdogs completely outsmart rigged, high-budget systems, are exclusively what we talk about here on WildRevival. So if you want to see how these hidden architectures actually work, make sure you hit subscribe. So here is the problem. If it wasn't instrument error, and it wasn't the commercial fishermen, what the hell was happening? Dr. Holloway decided to drop underwater cameras into those 3 sites. And what those cameras recorded over the next 4 months completely dismantled everything we thought we knew about invasive species and asset management. Because if the government wasn't killing the carp, and the fishermen weren't catching them, what exactly was in the water with them? So here's what happened. Dr. Holloway's cameras caught the first piece of the puzzle, and it was the native blue catfish. And the irony here is just insane. If you look back at the 1970s and 80s, American sport anglers treated these fish like literal garbage. I mean that literally. If you pulled a blue catfish onto the bank, you didn't keep it. You clubbed it and left it for the raccoons. We looked at this massive, powerful native predator and just stamped a value of 0 on it. We completely mismanaged our own biological portfolio. But by 2020, the catfish had quietly bounced back. And the underwater footage showed them doing something nobody expected. Blue catfish don't really chase their food. They ambush it. They have a sense of smell so sharp they can track prey from 50 feet away in water that looks like dark tea. The cameras showed them just sitting motionless in the current, waiting near schools of juvenile silver carp. Then, faster than you can actually see without slow-motion playback, they would lunge and inhale those 10-inch carp completely whole. And that's why it matters. The fish we threw on the bank for 50 years was now eating the most destructive invasive species in North American history. The researchers actually checked the stomachs of 317 blue catfish from those areas. 68% of them had juvenile silver carp inside. Some of them had 3 or 4 stacked up in there. Have you ever realized that something you thought was totally useless was actually your most valuable asset? Drop a comment below if you've ever had a budget flip or a realization like that in your own life. It happens in business and real estate all the time. And hey, if you appreciate the deep irony of a trash fish cleaning up a multi-million-dollar government mess, hit the like button for the catfish. But hey, race the problem. When you stop and actually think about this, the math just doesn't work. Sure, the catfish are clearing out the juveniles. But a blue catfish, even a massive 100-pound absolute unit of a fish, cannot swallow a 15-pound adult silver carp. It physically doesn't fit. Yet, Holloway's data showed the big, heavy breeding adults were disappearing, too. So if the catfish are only eating the kids, what exactly is in the dark water of the river that is terrifying enough to take out the parents? So what exactly eats a 15-pound adult breeding carp? To answer that, you have to look at an apex predator that actually survived the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. The alligator gar. These things are massive. 8 feet long, 300 pounds, and covered in scales so hard that pre-Columbian tribes used them as arrowheads. But here is the part that will absolutely drive you crazy. Between the 1930s and the 1980s, the government ran active eradication programs against the gar. They electroshocked the water. They literally dumped poison into the rivers. Why? Because wildlife managers assumed the gar were eating the bass and crappie that sport fishermen wanted. So they systematically wiped out the exact biological asset that could have prevented the entire carp crisis to begin with. By the way, if you are fascinated by how massive systems and governments completely misprice their most valuable assets, you need to subscribe. WildRevival is the only place you'll hear these specific types of arbitrage stories, and you won't want to miss the next one. Wait, but Asian carp are incredibly fast, right? They literally jump out of the water and break people's jaws to avoid boat motors. So if a gar is that massive and heavy, why don't the carp just swim away? Here is where the evolutionary mismatch comes in. Silver and bighead carp evolved in the rivers of eastern China. They are surface fish. They live entirely in the top 2 feet of the water column. Because of that, they have absolutely zero genetic memory of how to defend against a 300-pound armored predator gliding up from the dark river bottom. The gar doesn't chase them. It just drifts up from the shadows, completely invisible against the mud. And then, with one violent sideways slash of its long jaw, it snaps the carp's spine. If that evolutionary blind spot just gave you a massive aha moment about how nature balances its own books, hit the like button. It's brilliant. By the late 2000s, the gar had slowly started to recover in the lower Mississippi basin. And when they finally pushed up into the Illinois River, the cameras caught them doing exactly what they were built to do. They were taking out the 8 to 15-pound adult silver carp. They were eliminating the exact breeding class that the $600 million human bounty program failed to control. What is the biggest financial or systemic miscalculation you've ever seen a company or a government make? Tell me in the comments. Because paying millions to poison the one thing that could save you has to be near the top of the list. So the blue catfish handle the juveniles. And the alligator gar collect the adults. It looks like a perfectly closed loop, right? But if you actually sit down and run the numbers, there is a massive, gaping hole in this logic. A single female silver carp releases tens of thousands of eggs every single time she spawns. If even a fraction of those hatch into larvae, the catfish and the gar simply cannot eat fast enough to stop the invasion from rebounding. So what happens to the millions of microscopic larvae floating in the water? So if the gar handle the adults, and the catfish handle the juveniles, what happens to those millions of microscopic larvae floating in the slack water? Well, that brings us to the third fish in this story. The one almost nobody talks about, the bowfin. Just like the gar, the bowfin is a primitive, 70-million-year-old air breather. And just like the catfish, sport fishermen historically cursed it and threw it on the bank to rot. But the bowfin specializes in doing something neither the gar nor the catfish can do efficiently. It patrols the backwater sloughs where those fingernail-sized carp larvae drift, and it eats them by the hundreds. Stories about these perfectly designed, hidden systems that outsmart human engineering are exactly what we build here. You won't find these deep-dive arbitrage stories anywhere else, so if this changes how you see the world, make sure you subscribe to WildRevival right now. And here is where the entire picture suddenly clicks into place. If you pull all the way back and look at the whole board, you realize you aren't just looking at random fish eating other fish. You are looking at a complete, fully automated predation pyramid. The bowfin take the larvae. The blue catfish take the juveniles. The alligator gar take the breeding adults. Wait, so who organized this three-tiered defense? Who engineered 3 different native predators to attack 3 different life stages in 3 completely different parts of the river, closing every single door at once? Nobody. That is exactly the point. It was an already perfect, $0 system that was running flawlessly until we stepped in, declared the native assets worthless, and dismantled it ourselves. If seeing that full predation pyramid click into place just gave you that aha moment about how perfectly balanced nature actually is, hit the like button. That realization is huge. And I'm curious, do you think human intervention usually makes these types of systemic problems better, or do we almost always make them worse? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Once the native predators had about 30 years of uninterrupted recovery, the results spoke for themselves. In some pools of the Illinois River, the Asian carp population has dropped by an estimated 40 to 70% since 2018. No electric barrier achieved this. No state-funded commercial bounty achieved this. The river finally liquidated the massive Asian carp debt, and it did it entirely for free. But if you step back and look at this whole story from start to finish, it leaves us with one final, deeply uncomfortable question about how we actually view value, wealth, and the things we casually throw away. So here is how this whole thing ends. It's 6 o'clock in the evening on the Illinois River. Wade Karsten is pulling his last net of the day. He hauls it over the side of the boat, and inside is just a single fish. A broad-headed, 62-pound blue catfish. Its belly is completely distended. He takes a knife, opens the body cavity, and reaches in. One after another, he pulls out 3 half-digested silver carp. He just looks at them in his hand for a long time. And then he says something that basically sums up this entire $600 million saga. Nature don't need our help. It just needed us to get out of the way. We spent $607 million trying to kill the carp. The river was already doing it for free. We spent 100 years and hundreds of millions of dollars actively destroying the very assets that could have saved us. We thought the native fish were worthless trash, and we thought the electric barriers and government task forces were premium solutions. We had the valuations completely backwards. But here is the ultimate twist. The Asian carp that are still left in the river. The fish nobody wanted. They are actually showing up at fish markets now. Commercial markets in Chicago and Memphis are paying $3 to $4 a pound for them because the meat is lean and high in protein. The massive biological liability literally became a profitable, income-producing asset. The fish the government paid millions to destroy is now a commercial product being exported for cash. If that is the ultimate budget flip, where the biggest, most expensive problem in the river literally becomes the profit, hit the like button. Because you can't engineer an ending better than that. And seriously, if you want to understand the hidden mechanics of how real assets, systems, and underdogs actually win when no one is looking, this is exactly what we do here. You won't find these specific stories anywhere else, so make sure you subscribe to WildRevival. I actually want to know your take on this. What is a massive problem in your own life or work that you finally stopped over-engineering, and it just ended up fixing itself? Drop it in the comments. I'll be reading them. So when you look at this entire timeline, you are left with a lingering thought. It forces you to rethink how we define value. If a system this massive and complex can fix itself entirely for free the second we stop trying to over-engineer it, what else in our economy, or in our own lives, are we currently breaking just because we refuse to see its actual value?